With this YouTube, what we'd like to do is talk very briefly about the financial crisis and how the financial system works using our thrift characters. And we'd also like to talk about who's to blame. Now let's run through the process to see how this system worked. First of all, Mr. and Mrs. Mouse would get a mortgage from their bank. And they could either get a prime mortgage or their real estate agent convinced them that they wanted a big house. And so they went subprime with a variable rate. So Mr. and Mrs. Mouse get a mortgage from the bank. The bank, in turn, sells it to Freddie and Fannie. Now, why can they sell a subprime mortgage to Freddie and Fannie? Because our Senate and Congress passed legislation that allows them to do that. Now, Freddie and Fannie take those subprime mortgages, throw them into the pool. And that pool is packaged together by our friends on Wall Street. And our friends on Wall Street turn them into mortgage-backed securities, which are sold to investors. What does that do? That creates cash. And that cash flows all the way back to the bank so that other borrowers can continue to make mortgages. That's how the system works. As long as there's liquidity in the system and the cash flows back to the beginning, there's always cash available to buy homes. The system all worked very well with our thrift characters, and money was flowing until the housing market went flat. And then all of a sudden, liquidity stopped. When Wall Street stopped buying mortgages, there was no longer cash available to banks to do more loans. And that's when the crisis started. Now, who's to blame in this whole mess? We all want to point fingers. We want to blame the Democrats, the Republicans. We want to blame Wall Street for the trouble on Main Street. Let's talk about who's to blame. Let's start with the government, the U.S. Senate, Congress, and the President. We should have regulated Freddie and Fannie and regulated this mortgage industry. We also should not have passed regulation that forced lenders and Freddie and Fannie to take on these subprime mortgages, which forced risk into the system. Now let's talk about Wall Street. Wall Street had a lot to do with this crisis because they took those mortgages, pooled them together, and sold them as mortgage-backed securities. And the rating agencies rated them high. Now Wall Street was punished by this crisis as well because when they held all those mortgages and couldn't sell them as the crisis got more serious, many investment banks were put out of business, which brings back that old adage, pigs get fat and hogs get slaughtered. Then we have the S&Ls and banks and the mortgage brokers. These mortgage brokers and S&Ls and banks were writing mortgages that they did not have to keep. Therefore, they didn't have to live with the consequences of default. This was a system where they were able to earn windfall gains without dealing with the consequences of bad loans. As we talk about who's to blame, let's not forget about Freddie and Fannie, two government-sponsored entities. You'll notice that they're carrying American flags. These two entities were greatly involved in the crisis because they were pooling mortgages that they bought. And when the crisis got bad, they were holding mortgages they could not sell. They were stuck with those mortgages. Freddie and Fannie had a lot of problems as far back as 2002 when they committed financial fraud, much like WorldCom and Enron. Yet they didn't get regulated further or even get into more trouble because they were greatly involved in helping senators and congressmen getting elected through campaign contributions and lobbying. Therefore, as Freddie and Fannie were getting into trouble and getting out of control, they weren't being regulated and they were causing the system to be worse by buying mortgages that they could no longer sell. Now let's talk about our subprime borrowers. Our subprime borrowers were taking in loans that they could not afford. They were overextending themselves credit-wise, and they were greedy in that they were looking for homes that were beyond their means. This also created risk and caused a problem in the whole system. Of course, the whole system has greed in it. Greed is a good thing if it's controlled and regulated. Clearly, uncontrolled greed without dealing with consequences never works in any system, and that's part of the failure we're seeing today. And then last, let's talk about the media. The media has made this very confusing. They pitted Democrats against Republicans. They've talked about Main Street versus Wall Street. We've compared Senate and Congress, and we've blamed the president. Really, the issue here is we need to make this clear. This is a problem that everyone has been involved in. It's a system that wasn't working, and no one stepped up to fix it. That's the real problem, and the media needs to tell it that way. The thing that I want you to always remember is that every day is a great day to learn about finance.